Welcome back to the channel. Julius Caesar gave us a tagline for Roman legions throughout the empire. Veni, Vidi, Vici. My late Latin teacher would probably hit me for that pronunciation, but I think you know what I meant. Wherever the Romans roamed, once they conquered resistance, they came out of their fortifications and began building Roman cities. You'll find them scattered all over France and Italy and more, with considerable infrastructure often still in clear view. In other cases, there's just bits and pieces. Today we are going to visit the Roman-era remains on the left bank of Paris and indulge in far too much bistro food afterwards. Let's take a walk and burn off those calories here on the Armchair Traveler.
Hello and welcome back to the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy. I love to travel. I do this on my own, and so can you. I'm here to teach you how.
Lutetia, or Lutece in French, was founded in the 3rd century BCE on a big island in what is now the Seine River. The Parisi picked a pretty good spot to hole up. It was at the intersection of land and water trade routes, and the river on all four sides would have provided considerable defense from would-be attackers. I've circled the island in this model in green. That defense was not nearly enough against the well-organized, territory-hungry Roman army. 2 centuries later, it conquered the Parisi and eventually established a proper Roman city on the healthier, more easily defended higher ground to the south. There isn't nearly as much to see here as in many Roman outposts, but there's still quite a bit if you know where to look. This model, which used to be in the Archaeological Museum under Notre Dame Cathedral, I have no idea where it is now, shows what the city looked like when it was completed. Paris has been built over and redeveloped so many times that very little of the original architecture remains, but there are bits and pieces, sometimes quite large. Some of the buildings probably fell down of their own accord, mostly of old age. Much more was mined for building materials. Some of it is still visible in close to original form, like the amphitheater and parts of the bath. Roman urban planning usually followed a grid system. The idea was to have something fixed that they could replicate anywhere. The main north-south road was always called the Cardo Maximus. The main east-west route was always called the Decumanus. These roads were extended and more streets, including diagonal boulevards, were eventually added later as were needed. In this model, you can see how the main road, the Cardo Maximus, which I've marked with a black dotted line, runs from the island south. It's now the Rue Saint Jacques, one of the straightest roads in Paris. The red arrow shows you where the Forum was. The next thing the Romans would have built would have been baths. There were more than one, but the large one remaining is now the home of the Museum of the Middle Ages. I've marked it with a blue arrow. Everybody needed entertainment as well, not just the soldiers and the civilians who ran the Roman city, but the civilians on the outside. Off to the right in this photo, and marked with a black arrow, is the site of the amphitheater. I've overlaid a white dotted line showing the approximate area where specialists think the Roman Forum once stood. The area today is called the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. It wasn't a mountain the way I'd think about it, but it was significantly higher than the swamps located closer to the river. Higher ground meant fewer swamps meant fewer mosquitoes meant less disease. The Romans were health conscious. This model illustrates what archaeologists imagine the Roman Forum might have looked like. We already know it was built on high ground close to today's Pantheon and the Église Saint-Étienne. I'll show you those next time. It was lost for a millennium and a half. A French archaeologist, Théodore Vainqueur, rediscovered the site in the 19th century, quite by accident. While he was working on construction of the Rue Soufflot, he revealed the remains of one wall in 1853. He was the same man who excavated the Roman theater, the Arénes de Lutece, which will be our last stop today. The rather prominent road on the right edge of the Forum, marked with white dashes, was the Cardo, today straight as an arrow Rue Saint Jacques. The large building on the edge of the Cardo was the basilica. A Roman-era basilica was a meeting hall. In ancient Rome, they were the site for legal matters to be carried out and a place for business transactions. Since they were large and usually fairly sturdy, after Christianity was introduced, many were converted into churches. That's why we call some Catholic churches basilicas to this day. The road on the far left is today's Boulevard Saint-Michel, generally called the Boule Mich. Given how straight it remains in this area to this day, it must also have been a Cardo, although it wasn't the main one. The building with pillars to its right in the model was simple. The street in front of the Forum was the main east-west route, then called the Decumanus, and part of what is today's Rue Saint Jacques. Roman fora always featured large open spaces, shown prominently here between the temple and the basilica, in which the citizens might meet, greet, chit-chat, and generally transact business. The buildings just outside the piazza or plaza, opening onto the space, housed food shops and other establishments. Today, almost nothing remains of the original Forum, although they have discovered a few footings for nearby houses. The hill on which it sat, now called the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, is still visible. This is the Pantheon, which we'll visit in our next walk. The rise in the ground in front of you was not an optical illusion. It does sit on a high point in the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. My photo was taken from the western edge of the site and shows the slight but distinct rise uphill along the Rue Soufflot. The modern name here translates as the Cluny Baths and refers to only a small part of today's facility. Tapestry lovers make this a must-see. I admit it is fascinating. I first visited here in 1970 when the big attraction really was the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries. They are still here, but there is much more. Before this was a museum, it was the Hotel de Cluny, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And long before that, it was a huge Roman-era bath complex. In the Roman period, the northern thermal baths, which these are, covered the area roughly mapped out by the Boulevard Saint-Michel and Saint-Germain to the east and west, the Rue de Cluny and the Rue des Écoles. More than 1.5 acres large, they were the largest public baths in the city. They have been closed for years for restoration. The pandemic doubtless extended the conclusion of the ongoing work. This model shows the major elements of the bath. In the center of the picture is the frigidarium, which we can still see to this day. To the left is the tepidarium or warm room, and to the right, I believe, is the caldarium. This entire area would have been at ground level in the Roman era. That it is so far below ground level today owes to the fact that the ground level has risen, not that the building has sunk. As you can see, only about 1/3 of the massive facility has been excavated. Like all Roman baths, they were open freely to the public, and were meant to be, at least partially, a means of Romanizing the ancient Gauls. Excavation is ongoing, but my best guess is that only about 1/3 of it has been uncovered. Some of it is likely under today's Hotel de Cluny and will never be uncovered. Today, all that remains is the frigidarium, a monumental room that gives an idea of the technical competence of Roman construction. Its vaults rise over 14 meters high. They are among the best preserved in northern France. This photo was taken in 2014, before the most recent restoration began. You're looking more or less to the north here. The Boule Mich would be off to your left. From here, the drop to ground level is obvious. This view also shows just how far below today's ground level the original facility is. This multi-purpose amphitheater is going to be the final stop on our walking tour of Roman Paris. It was the biggest in France. This was a double-duty facility. Gladiators once fought here, both with animals and each other. At the base of the arena, you can just make out openings where the animals might have been turned loose on the gladiators. The building doubled as a theater. On the left side of this photo, you can see what would have been the back wall or the sound wall and a covered stage. On the left is a wall and marking showing what the entryway might have looked like originally. On the right is a row of rather large houses. The original seating area here has been repurposed as a sturdy foundation and retaining wall for those buildings. In the photo on the left side, you can make out a small piece of what had been seating, now surrounded by the buildings. Roman amphitheaters typically were built into hills whenever possible, so seats could be set on the hill instead of being dug out. Some of the stones, which doubtless formed the seating, where the trees are now, just above the wall, were mined as early as the 3rd century. The mining continued after that. Reusing already cut stone certainly was going to be much easier than cutting it anew. When Lutece was sacked during the barbarian raids of AD 275, some of the stonework was actually disassembled and moved to reinforce the city's defenses around the Ile de la Cité. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and Chilperic I, who was a Merovingian, was king of this part of France. He got there by a very complicated move involving, probably, murdering his own brother and marrying the brother's wife. There was more, but I'll let you look it up for yourselves. He ruled for over 20 years, but spent most of his reign fighting one person or another. He actually had the amphitheater repaired in 577 and gave performances there. Later on, however, the theater became a cemetery and eventually was filled in completely following the construction of the wall of Philip Augustus in the 13th century. It wasn't unearthed again until the 19th century. This is another view of that seating area. The seats likely extended all the way up to the top of today's Weedville Park. You can just make out steps leading further up the hill on the right-hand side of the photo. We have traveled far, at least in terms of time in the past, and now it's time for a late lunch. In France, there are at least 3 traditional kinds of dining establishments. A bistro usually is a casual neighborhood joint that offers typical French cuisine. Restaurants come in many variations and serve a lot of different kinds of food. They tend to be far more formal than the bistro. Restaurants and bistros serve lunch and dinner at fixed hours. The hours may differ, but usually run from 12 until 2 or 2:30 for lunch. Then they close until dinner and normally don't open up again until 7, but stay open late until midnight for supper. And then there is the brasserie. A brasserie serves throughout the day till sometimes extremely late at night and has a larger menu and usually very traditional French cuisine. They exist as much for fun as for dining. You will find traditional French favorites, including oysters, coq au vin, escargot, often game and calf's liver, both of which I like, cassoulet, which I adore, and choucroute garni, which I truly love. I've walked past this brasserie dozens of times in the last 50 years, but my brasserie of choice has always been another one further up the street. I walked past this one on the way to the Latin Quarter, stopped and looked and decided to come back. This time I wanted to try someplace different on the theory that there are so many restaurants and so few meals. La Brasserie de l'Île Saint-Louis has been sitting on this spot for 3 generations. I had never had escargot and was determined to get the choucroute garni as well. I can report that the food was delicious. I had my baked escargot and learned that they are normally prepared on a special plate. Basically, escargots seem to be an excuse to eat butter and garlic in public. Choucroute garni means decorated sauerkraut. The dish hails from Alsace. Variations depend usually on what's available locally, but in my experience always include the sauerkraut, potatoes, onions, and several kinds of meat. The meat can be one of any of several dark or white sausages and often includes ham or pork roast or both. This, along with the bread and beer, left me feeling overstuffed and regretful that there was no way to take the leftovers back to my hotel. Thank you for joining me on this walk and for the lunch. I look forward to seeing you next time on The Armchair Traveler. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's free to you, but it will help the channel grow. Travel sites and history can be word-heavy, especially background information, so some of my video blogs have companion pieces with more for you. There are also pieces which don't make it into video format at all. You can check them out on my WordPress blog site. The address is armchairtraveler2022.wordpress.com. If you'd like to keep up when I post new blogs or video blogs or are interested in tweet-sized posts, follow me on Twitter. My handle there is @armchair2022. I will tweet updates for new posts, and when I begin traveling again, we'll take you along in short form on Twitter.